Hey everyone, today we've got Steve Zolman, who's the CEO of SafeStreets, a nationwide security provider. This is such a fun episode. Steve is seriously an incredible individual. He goes through his early career founding Pinnacle Security, ultimately exiting that to Protection One, and then getting into SafeStreets. He also talks about his foundation and charity called Tiny Hero, which is an incredible story with his son, Adam. So really excited for you guys to learn from Steve today, hear his story in the security space. And with that, let's dive in. All right, everyone, welcome to another episode of the show. Today we have Steve Zolman, who is the CEO of SafeStreets, a nationwide ADT Security Authorized Provider with 300 plus trained consultants covering more than 90% of the U.S. Steve has enjoyed a successful career in the security industry. He founded Pinnacle Security in 1998 and later merged with a company called Homeland Protection. By 2013, Pinnacle had secured more than 500,000 homes and was purchased by Protection One. Thereafter, Steve served as CRO of EVO Alarm, a top 10 ADT authorized dealership. So I know that's more business than just scratching the surface, Steve, but I am really excited to have you in and hear your story today. Thanks for being here.
I'm honored. Thanks for letting me join you today, Chase.
Absolutely. So I'd love to hear a little bit about your upbringing, Steve. Like any influences, fundamental things in your childhood, teenage years that kind of molded you to who you are today. Would love to hear about that.
Yeah, sure. Well, I grew up primarily in Taylorsville, one of 9 kids, and my parents were brilliant. I look back and I realized that a lot of my early years, my formidable years, really created a lot of motivation for me. I mean, being one of 9 kids, my dad lived his life on his own terms, which as I've gotten older, I respect more. He decided he wanted to be an entrepreneur and decided to get into genealogy, which at the time wasn't Ancestry.com. It was going down to, the church office building and doing some research and pulling files and microfiche. And we always were concerned about money in our family. We just never, it was always a concern. And I remember being like 5 years old. My mom made this really good caramel popcorn. And so we balled them up, and I couldn't have been more than 5 or 6. Had a big basket, went door to door, sold them. I remember taking all this money back to my house. My mom took her share for all the expense and gave me the rest. And I think she took more than I made, which instilled in me early that there's expenses along with any business endeavor. But money was always an issue, and I think it helped create in me a desire to, a little bit of independence. I mean, I mowed more lawns than I care to remember, to the point where I don't own a lawnmower now because I feel like I paid my dues. Yeah. As soon as I could afford to pay a neighbor kid, I did. But they created an environment where there was a lot of self-sustainment, where it was like, I've got 8 other kids. Like, if you need that designer brand or you want those Nikes, like, we got a pay less shoe budget and, a pair of jeans and a few shirts. And so I look back fondly. I have wonderful siblings, having 6 sisters and 2 brothers. Like, I adore these people, but as every year that I've gotten older, I'm more appreciative of what good parents I had in instilling in me at a young age. If you want something, just go out and get it. Even to the point where I remember my parents saying, it's really important for you to pay for your own mission. And I remember kind of taking it like, what could I possibly do to make that kind of money? And I had a couple of my sisters my mom's youngest sister lived in Alaska, and my older sisters went there and worked in a cannery. And I thought, and they'd made pretty good money. So when I was 16, or maybe I was 17, I was going into my senior year, the summer before my senior year. I just got on a plane with a buddy and showed up to Petersburg, Alaska, and found a fishing boat that would take me on. I worked on a commercial fishing boat and kind of paid for my mission that way. But I would have never had any of those kind of job experiences had my parents been like, let me just cover you. Or, right. If I wanted to play football, I had to come up with the dues. If I wanted a mountain bike, I had to pay for it myself. There was no ever big surprises like, oh, we got you a car, or oh, we got you. It was like, we're running tight. So Yeah. So my early upbringing, I think, really helped instill in me this sense that if you put your mind to something, my dad was so good at telling me to visualize with athletics, or like, if you see it in your mind, Steve, you can accomplish anything. And so I look back fondly, even though there's certainly, all of us have our rough points in childhood. I look back and say my parents did the absolute best they could with what they had. And, and I feel very blessed to be in a longing environment, because it created a hunger I don't think I could have duplicated any other way.
Yeah, I love that. And how have you tried to recreate that or replicate that within your own family? Because I think every entrepreneur, I mean, you have all this success and you're like, well, how do I balance giving my kids everything that they want or everything I didn't have versus teaching them some of the lessons that you learned? How have you been able to strike that balance?
Well, I don't know that. I don't know that I've successfully done that. I think, I feel I have wonderful kids. I have 6 kids, and it is a real struggle, especially if you live in a neighborhood where it's normal for kids to get a brand new car when they're 16 or,
yeah.
But we've always tried to implement, if you've got to be anxiously engaged in something. And we had the benefit, a few years back, we bought a farm in Alpine that had a functioning orchard on it. And so we had about 5 years, and it was so fun. We had like 2,500 fruit trees. So we had the peaches, and wow. and there was a couple years there where I was in between a transaction. So I became a farm hand, and I would deliver fruit, and had a commercial deal with the Associated Foods Group where I would deliver apples and peaches, and my kids would help. And then we do a little bit of farmers market on the weekends down at my old neighborhood in Taylorsville or Murray out there on Redwood Road. So we always are looking for opportunities for our kids to be able to see how the money works. And now that they're getting older, they can come, work the front desk at my office, or, clean it or whatever. But we've really tried to focus and make it, if you're excelling, then having a job isn't as important as, being a team player, making sure that you're going the extra mile. And for some of my kids, they enjoy working and like the benefits of that. So I don't know that I've got it totally nailed, because there's so many things that you just wish your kids could understand. I'm like, I wish I could just take you back to like 85 and just let you see how I grew up, and my wife the same. Like, go back to when she was a kid. We live in a much different world, obviously. But I have great kids, and the biggest deal there is I've got a great wife, and she was raised. So here's a cool story about my wife. She was raised by, her dad was in his 40s when he joined the church, and then met my mother-in-law. So he didn't have his first kid until he was in his late 50s.
Oh, wow.
Right. So she kind of skipped a generation. She got somebody who remembered the Depression. Mm-hmm. So my wife is the ultimate epitome of frugality. So what I've lacked in trying to make up for not being able to buy Jordans when I was a kid, my wife has kind of put the kibosh on some of that opulence, which I'm very thankful for. So she has the old school mindset. So she kind of, I might be the accelerator and she's the brake as it pertains to consumption, or do we really need that? She's a great sounding board that way.
Yeah, that's great. A good balance.
Yep.
Well, I read that you went to BYU, Idaho, BYU. I guess I like to hear your thought process going into school. You had the experiences you had as a child and growing up. You learned, how to work for yourself. But what was your mentality going into college education? Like, hey, I want to go get a job. I want to start a business. How did you think about what you studied and all that?
Yeah, so I was a little bit disadvantaged from the standpoint of kind of having 9 kids in our family. The independence created this, like, you guys need to manage your own high school career. And if I got good advice, I didn't take it as far as pushing. I got decent grades, but I'm taking weightlifting and pottery or whatever. I didn't really push. Like, I had friends who were taking AP and things like that. So I was really focused on athletics in high school. That was what really fired me up. So I was at the older end. I had a September birthday, so I was one of the first to turn 19 in my class. So I'm kind of like graduate from high school, and then that fall I'm submitting my mission papers. And so I went on my mission with zero, secondary education, came home, and then it was kind of like the reality. I get home, my first thing my dad says is, it costs almost $300 to live here now and so I immediately had a rent bill because Papa Z is like, it's you pay your way once you're over 18 around here. And so I immediately went to work, but I knew I needed to get to school. So I took an entire semester and just worked so I could afford to go up to BYU, Idaho. And my mentality was I probably should the richest guy in my neighborhood who had jet skis was a dentist, and the other rich guy was a lawyer. And I'm like, I don't know if I could do the teeth thing. I hate needles. I hate blood. And so maybe I should just be an attorney. So I thought, well, I'll just do like business management, something I'm semi-interested in, and let me just knock out my general. So I initially went up to BYU, Idaho with one of my best friends from high school to play football. And they gave me an option to redshirt, and I was already kind of 22. And I'm like, oh man, I don't see myself being here until I'm 28. So if it was been pre-mission, I would have for sure played because I thought my world revolved around that. But post-mission, I'm like, I'm having to pay for all this. And at the time, I was milking cows at like 3:30 in the morning to just be up in Rexburg. My dad sent me with a $20 bill, but the rest of it I had to cover. So I felt like it was up at BYU, Idaho, where I was like, I really need to just get this school thing going. So I got good grades, and I enjoyed being up at BYU because, of course, I met my wife. So I was up there only about a year, and then she got accepted to BYU and Utah's nursing program, chose the U, and that's when I then transferred down to BYU Provo.
Got it. Cool. That's great. Yeah. And how did you ultimately evolve from, potentially being an attorney to your early career? And I couldn't find a ton, Steve, about like what you did right out of school, but yeah, tell us a little bit about like that transition out of school and what you did.
Well, so when I was up in Idaho milking cows, that was my primary source of income to pay for my bills. I broke my hand and needed surgery, so I could no longer milk cows because I was in a cast and whatever. Yeah. But I had a buddy who was selling living scriptures, the old kid videos, like the church kid videos. And I knew he was doing really well. And he's a serial entrepreneur himself, a guy you should probably have on here, Mike Strong. He said, I'll just send you the book, send you like how to sign up, and just go knock doors. And obviously, having been in Oklahoma on my mission, knocking doors, I wasn't afraid of anything Sugar City, Idaho was going to throw at me because I'd been talking to Baptists for 2 years and they scared me. Right. They're good. And so I was like, I went and hit doors on one Saturday, and I made more money in one Saturday selling living scriptures than I could waking up at 4 a.m, 4 or 5 days a week milking cows. So I'm like, okay, this is my jam. So I did that for about a year and maybe not quite a year, but the guy that I worked with decided he was going to go sell security and he was going to manage an office. So he's like, hey, I'm putting together the Salt Lake office, wondering if you're interested. And I'm like, God, I like this. I can work a mall kiosk and it's kind of at my leisure and I'm making great money and I'm going to focus on school. And he then bounced and like got an internship. And so the bosses of that company, it was called Safe Home Security, they called me and said, hey, we see you've had success selling. We're out a manager, but we've already recruited 6 or 7 guys. If you had 6 or 7 friends that you could bring, we'll let you manage the office because you have sales experience. Yeah. And so that was my first year selling home security, which was in '98. Okay. And that's when I got my first taste of knocking doors and doing the summer program.
Yeah. And so that would have been like your sophomore year, like sometime during school. Yep. And that was like when you were still in Idaho. You're still based up in Idaho.
Yeah. I had just I came down that summer. Okay. Yeah. So we moved down that summer, and I just moved into the apartment, and I didn't have to pay rent at my dad's house. So I was pretty stoked.
There you go.
Yeah.
And where were you selling then? What market?
Yeah. Salt Lake. Yeah. So we had an office in Rose Park.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that was, the company was Safe?
Safe Home.
Safe Home.
Yeah. Safe Home Security. Yeah. They no longer exist, but.
Okay. So you have your first, security sales experience. I mean, how did that summer go? Was it like, you're making money hand over fist? Was it a struggle? Like what?
Oh yeah. Well, I think the biggest, the upside and downside was that when we went and did a training day, they were like, hey, before we get going for the summer, we'd like you to meet people. We'd like you to come out and do this training day. And we went out to Tooele, and they gave me the paperwork. They said, here, this is what you should say. And I walked up, they dropped me off on a corner and said, meet us back here in 4 hours. And I knocked the first door I knocked. I'm like, hi, I'm Steve. I'm selling home security. Wondering if you're interested. I mean, the worst pitch, right? And she was like, oh yeah, we've been thinking about it. Why don't you come in? And so I literally spent the next 2 hours like writing up a bid and calculating it. And she was so nice. And the whole time I'm just thinking, man, I got this. Like, I'm a good salesman. We got to the end. I'm like, okay, it's like $500 in upgrades. And then you have to write 2 checks, 69 for the first month and 69 for the last month. She wrote it all out. I got the paperwork, went back out on the street corner, and they're like, oh my gosh, you got $500 in upgrades? And they're like, we are so glad you're the manager. So I take that one experience and apply it to an office now of 6 people I don't know. I'm meeting for the first time. And 6 or 7 buddies that I went to high school with or were associated with friends that I knew from Taylorsville. And the first training was like, you just go to the door and tell them who you are and you write up the bid.
Yeah.
And we like belly flopped. Like everybody was like, everyone hates us. We've spent the better part of 2 or 3 weeks just absolutely spinning our wheels to the point where my best friend came to me and is like, dude, I'm making like $2 an hour. I just got to go back to another job. And so him and I had this conversation where it's like, okay, they made us keep track of how many doors we knocked for some reason. And he's like, okay, I knocked this many doors and I sold 2. If I just doubled that and we sold 4, like this summer would be worth it if we could sell 4 a week. So the next day he came back and ran door to door. He's just like, I got to cover double the doors. And what I did is I went to Barnes and Noble. Back in the day, we weren't buying Audibles yet. I went and found a book, and and I don't know if it was Brian Tracy. I should find the book because it was such a pivotal point for me in that first year. It was all about getting 5 no's. So the premise of the little booklet was, don't ever leave after the first no. So I said, okay, you run door to door. I'm just going to get 5 no's. And it was within an hour or 2, we were getting called from the front office. They're like, hey, Steve, you're kind of scaring people. They say you're being awfully pushy. Because I was like, what are they going to, they're going to fire me anyway. So I was very, very pushy. But what I found is as I started figuring out how to deflect a no, and the more I talked, the more people were like, this isn't your typical door-to-door guy. This is a guy who's actually selling something that could potentially bring me some peace of mind. And so in that experience, that week, Adam and I had our breakout weeks, and everybody's like, what are you guys doing? So my first real training was like, you run door to door and you do not stop until you get 5 no's. So you keep talking, and you'll get better at it. And long story short, our office ended up finishing first out of 3. There was like a San Diego and a Boise office. And they asked me the next year to run the entire summer program. Wow. And so that was a big deal for me. And then it was just like 18 months later that I founded Pinnacle Marketing. It wasn't security yet. So from that experience, it kind of led to them asking me, there was an Orkin dealer that was in Provo at that same time. It was owned by a dude named Brett Bingham, who was kind of a kingpin. Like, they were the biggest. And the company that I was working for, they said, hey, this Orkin dealer said, hey, we'd like to start selling security, and we have all these guys that can sell it. And so we would both go out recruiting. So they went out and started recruiting as a sub dealer for this safe home. Well, I would run into somebody that would say, hey, oh yeah, I've already talked to my Orkin, like, I'm going to go with these guys. I'm like, why would you go with them when you can go with the mother company? Like, I am Safe Home. Mm-hmm. Well, that got back to the owners of Safe Home, and they came to me and said, Steve, we need you to just not be part of us. So it was almost happenstance that I end up like in this position where it's like, oh, you're about to own. And I said, okay, so what does that mean? They're like, well, you'll be in charge of your own payroll. Like, you have to work for us as like a sub because you're interfering with our big opportunity here. Because I mean, I was like 2 or 3 offices. These guys could do 20. And so that's how Pinnacle Security started, because it was Pinnacle Marketing. And then I signed a contract with those owners to sell for them for 3 years. And then it was after those 3 years, then I just go off on my own and create, and Pinnacle Marketing became Pinnacle Security.
So it sounds like it was some affiliate agreement with Pinnacle and the company, a Safe Home, that you were selling some of their product basically to. Yeah,
they were the master dealer. They would submit the paperwork and then they would pay me and they would take their scrape.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. So how did that evolve to Pinnacle Security eventually?
So at that point it was, we could see that there was some fracturing where it was like, we aren't going to be able to stay in this environment. And I mean, the aha experience for me was like, if you have to make payroll, you have to have money. And I didn't have any money. My wife and I had just bought this little condo at Airport 2 out in West Jordan. And it was right before the Olympics. And we thought, man, this would be great for us to build a little equity. We got a little first time buyer, $5,000 from the city of West Jordan. But we had about $30,000 that we could pull on a HELOC on a home equity line. And that was my kind of burn the ships moment. So I go home, talk to my wife, who just kind of landed her first job as a nurse up at Primary Children's. She's so happy. And luckily she had that job, because what we didn't know jumping in was we just jumped on a roller coaster, as you hear on this podcast so often. So it was at that point that we had to pull that full $35,000. And I remember thinking, if I don't pay this back, I am so screwed. Like, I will spend the rest of my life trying to figure this out. But it was also creating this different energy. I'm like, I wake up different. I don't go to bed until I feel like I've gotten what I need to done. And so it created this energy where it's like, I'm all in. And so that experience for me is what kind of turned Pinnacle Marketing into this fleeting, like, this is a way for me to pay for school, to, we may have something here. And I started having to get the licenses. That's really the only difference between a marketing company and a security company, is just licensing. And some of that's a little more rigorous depending on the state, but we just started knocking out licensing in the states that we wanted to go and represent ourselves. And then we ended our relationship with Safe Home. They went out of business, and we kind of took the reins from there and went and signed direct deals with either Monotronics or ADT.
And those are the actual suppliers of the hardware, like like what you're putting into homes, ADT or the other suppliers. Yeah. So you sign an agreement with them and say, hey, we now have the rights to sell your product and install it under the Pinnacle name. Is that
essentially
kind of how it works?
Yeah, essentially. And they typically, they're some of those big guys are agnostic to the equipment. They're more just like the funding entity. So they'll pay me a premium to hand them a contract. So I go sign you up and I charge you $50 a month on a 5-year contract. I can then sell that to ADT. They give me my money to cover the equipment, the installer, the salesman, and hopefully I can make a margin.
Got it. Okay.
So it's more of a transactional relationship where I now become the sales arm for that given entity.
For them. Okay.
Yeah.
And that 30,000 HELOC, so what was that used for? I mean,
like payroll and we were in a building that was just right next to the railroad tracks in Provo. It was the cheapest thing we could find, 5 or 6 little offices. So it was to back in those days, you really didn't start recruiting until the end of January, because it's like, why would I talk to someone about the summer and the fall? Yeah. So we would kind of like finish the summer in September. And then it was like, we'll resurrect this thing in January and start talking about the summer. And so that's when I would start recruiting. So it then became recruiting, like paying guys to go and recruit, create some incentives. We had little training budgets. So I was very surprised how quickly it evaporated.
Oh, yeah.
But I also am a simple enough guy that I loved that I could say, well, every time we sell one of these, I know kind of the number of what it's going to do to affect my bottom line.
Yeah.
So it wasn't overly sophisticated being a new entrepreneur. I could be like, okay, unit of 1, I make $400. Okay, if I have this build, this is how many I need to sell.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, maybe walk us through, because you hear about summer sales, the pest contracts, the security contracts, and I think there's a bunch of different ways reps get paid, or how you guys as a business owner, you think about your cash flow and paying your reps and the commissions and the product. But maybe walk us through like a simple example, like someone's on a door, you have a rep on the door, what the contract value is, how they get paid, how you make money, as the business owner. I mean, how do you kind of think about those transactions? How do you guys make money as a security company?
Yeah. So the simplest form, it's literally, I knock your door, you say I'm in, I'm fine with $60 a month. Here's the package. I get you your doorbell camera, a little bit of life safety, maybe a smoke detector. We kind of we give the salespeople kind of parameters to work within. You do more, you get docked, or you have to charge the customer. You do less, maybe you can bank some equipment for another deal or whatever. But ultimately, once a customer says, yes, I'm willing to pay the $50 a month, that's where all the value is. So you as the customer are going to then sign that contract. That contract's going to be on whoever I'm representing's paperwork. So it's a legal tender that they tell me needs to be signed. And I follow those requirements. I then submit that to, let's say, ADT. And then ADT will take whatever the monthly monitoring is, which would be $60 in this example. And they would say, that is based on your credit score, that's worth 38x $60. 38 times 60. So, I don't know what that quick math is, but let's just say it's $2,500.
Okay.
So out of the $2,500, I got to pay you $600 or $700 as a salesman.
Okay.
I've got to pay $200 or $300 for all the equipment. I've got to pay $150 to $200 to the installer. I then have, admin expense, and I got an office somewhere, and I've got to set aside something for a recruiting budget, and so all of a sudden you have kind of this waterfall.
Yep.
So we in our industry, or at least at my company, we talk about everything having a creation cost. So on my total stack, how much is that costing me? Like a sign and a sticker cost me, 35 cents of my stack. So you can kind of take that entire stack and associate all of the given expenses, and then you just take, did I do 1,000? Did I do 10,000? And then we can break it all out and say, okay, this is what it's costing us to run the company.
Yeah.
And in that stack, you're hoping you've got your margin,
right?
And that's what took us the better part of 5 years to figure out. Was we were really good at generating revenue, not really good at putting revenue in the bank.
Got it.
Right.
And that when ADT determines like 38x the monthly pay or whatever, is that I mean, you mentioned credit score, but like how is that derived? Are they just saying we're gonna retain this customer for X amount of years, and so therefore it's worth this amount? Like, where does that number come from?
Yeah, I know. Yeah, they kind of view it as they say their data would suggest that a customer would stay between 7 and 8 years.
Okay.
So they kind of look at the initial term as a way to try to get to zero.
Yeah.
Right. But yeah, credit score has a factor in what it's worth. The other thing is they would rather auto pay if I can get you to say just debit my checking account every month. They'll give you a little kicker for that.
Sure.
But they also we have to use their credit facilities. So they probably have an algorithm that kind of gets anything less than probably a 625 or 600 credit score. So you do have to qualify. So that becomes kind of something that sales guys have to deal with. But the majority, we don't really, like a sales rep doesn't have that visibility into what the customers, they just get told A, B, or C or whatever on the credit and like move forward.
Yeah. And then ADT, will they write that check at basically contract signing? Like they send you $2,500 after,
within 7
couple
days
weeks or whatever. Yeah.
We have a weekly funding. Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So it's a little bit, it kind of appeals to the hand to mouth. So they're like in the ADT environment that we're in right now, there's probably 100 or 150 dealers. Other than one other company, we'll do as much as like 60 of them.
Wow.
Right. They're mostly small guys that maybe have like an HVAC company and they're like, oh, I could talk to customers. I can sell 10 of these a month.
Yeah.
And they fill out the paperwork and send it in. So ADT doesn't have a ton of guys that do kind of the entire country. They have guys that do regional, or they'll do 2 or 3 states, or they'll just do one state.
Got it. Yeah. So then wrapping up with, Pinnacle, read that you guys ultimately had a sale or exit to Protection One. I mean, maybe take us through that ride, high level, how that all shook out.
It's crazy because like I couldn't have imagined. Cause, I mean, let's also be clear as far as my education, that one of my biggest regrets, which you're going to ask me at some point, I know that is that I didn't get to school quicker, because I was about 3 years in taking upper division business classes. And I would go to these classes. My wife and I just thought it's so important for me to get an education. And I was doing everything in my power. And we grew so fast that by the time I'm in my 3rd year at BYU, I mean, we have like 400 employees. And I'm going to these classes where we're talking about basic business, and no disrespect to some of the beautiful people up at the business, but we were being taught by guys who'd never run a company.
Right.
And we're doing a lot of this like hypothetical, and you got a lot of hands getting raised saying, well, when I was a district leader, when I was a zone leader, when I was an AP, and I'm like, boys, like the real world is nothing like, I mean, there are some interaction concepts, but you know, it's much different. So the professors always loved when I came, because I think I had a cool recruiting card, because I was trying to fake it till I made it. But I had very keen, raw, real-time business. But I eventually had to just drop out. Like I had to call it. And I'm like, okay, I have a job now. So I'm 30 credits away, and I really should just go knock these credits out. But in the end, it was like in 2008. So here we started Pinnacle in 2001. By 2008, we decided we wanted to go and compete with the big boys. Like a little bit of naivety. And we said, okay, well, what we need a funding entity. So how do we do that? We put together a SIM, hired a broker out of Southern California. And the next thing you know, we're in front of the Harvard guys, right? And they're like, and this guy graduated from Taylorsville. Like, this is his degree. And so it was just this, it was the coolest experience, one, to be validated when you sit in a room with private equity and have them tell you all the things that you've done that they've never seen. Because we were just down here in the valley where there were other people doing it as big or bigger than we were, but they were like, this is American ingenuity. Like, wow, what you guys have created, like so much revenue and so much action. And so Golden Gate became our partners. They bought 70% of our company. I did an evaluation that I just never fathomed. And so in 2008, we got a payday and a transaction that prior to it, I would have thought was life-changing. It was so anticlimactic. I was so disappointed that having that much money didn't feel better. And really, and I think that would be something I would say to any entrepreneur. Like, you got to have a holier cause than getting paid, because if that is your only drive, one, you probably won't put up with the pain it takes to get paid. But two, when it comes, it's going to be so anticlimactic that if that's your only reason, you're going to put off more important things to try to make more, and you're going to miss life. So it was the best experience, because it made me realize that growing up poor or not having a lot of resource, that having money is totally overblown. It is not as cool as everyone would think. It's nice to pay off a house. It's nice to have a car that doesn't have a payment. It's nice to be able to help somebody in need, but it does not define life. Because I was happy in Taylorsville, right? I didn't have a sad childhood. And I was like, wait, I'm the same person. I just have a few extra bucks in my account. So in 2008, we had that. So Protection, or Golden Gate, paid us. Basically, they became our leverage point. So I think they gave us like a $500 million line of credit. And for 5 years, we just put every account in-house. And it was Pinnacle. There was no ADT, no Monotronics, no funding entity. We had all these contracts in-house. And it was awesome, because obviously my skill set wasn't operations. It wasn't numbers. It wasn't banking relationships. It was selling, and it was recruiting and motivating. And so now I get to just go and do that 100%. So the company took off, and we grew, we expanded, and we had just an absolute blast. And then we got to the end of that. So we were at the end, and this is an awesome story, because so many of your listeners know who Vivint are. So in 2000, I think it was 13, Golden Gate comes to us and says, hey, we like we're done. We're good. It's 5 years. Let's go take all of our contracts. We had a few $100,000, and we went and sold them on the open market. Everyone got their money. It was kind of high fives all around. And my partners, all but one partner and I, are left. And Golden Gate was just like, you guys can take the company. And right before Golden Gate decided to start selling, that's when Vivint was doing their deal with Blackstone. And I guess this is total hearsay, so somebody may send you a message as to how this actually went down, but this is how it went down for me. It's the next thing I know is like, hey, Blackstone has asked Vivint, who is your biggest competitor? Well, it's me. It's Pinnacle. And so we ended up with, they said, well, we'll earmark $20 million for you to go buy as many of their people as you can. Total devastation, bro. Like and these were guys who I loved, and they showed me a text message from one of the bosses saying, I will give you $750,000 today to bring your team.
Wow.
And I am like, luckily I'd had a transaction, and so I wasn't like going to the poorhouse. But it was like I watched these people that I loved, more so all the back office, like all the operations. Like I had to start letting people go for the first time in my career, and it was horrifying. And it was rough. It was really rough. Like to because I couldn't look at my guys and say, yeah, you shouldn't take that.
Right.
I had to say, guy, you got to take that, man. I hate it, but you got to take it. So they put a real dent. What they didn't realize is that there were people who couldn't be bought, and there were people who stayed with us. And it was literally within 6 months. My partner and I now, who are the only two left, are in another private equity office in Chicago, GTCR, talking with the CEO of Protection One, Tim Wall, who was saying, hey, can we buy you guys? I'm like, okay, yeah, do you want to buy us? And we spent 14 days talking about a deal. And in 14 days, we came up with a production-based where it was based on performance. They needed to create a residential growth story, and they had been trying for 5 years and couldn't do it. And they said, listen, if over the next 5 years you can install 80,000 accounts, we'll give you this number. And my partner and I looked at each other and were like, dude, that's as big a number as we just got with Golden Gate. And we got half the company, maybe a third of the company. And this dude is willing to pay us that if we will backload the production and not take as much up front. So we take, a couple to few up front to just be for goodwill, but then everything was based on performance. We installed 80,000 accounts in 3 years.
Wow.
And it was one of those where it's like, this is why entrepreneurs got to stick in. Because there was that point where it's like, dude, just go to a beach. Like, just go do something. Go invest in real estate and just be okay. But there were people that were counting on us at that time. And even though it might have been a nice little lifestyle kickback for us, it wasn't the right time to just get out. And so, as luck would have it, we then went and worked for Protection One. This was the only time in my career that I actually worked for someone and had zero ownership. And so we hit that 3-year mark. We did the 80,000 accounts, and now I'm sitting with Apollo down in Texas, and they're saying, we're going to buy Protection One, and then we're going to go buy the ADT. And the bosses at Protection One were like, you guys helped us create this growth story. We're going to go run ADT. So Apollo bought Protection One, and then all of our cohorts, like our equals at Protection One, then went and ran ADT. And they went, Apollo, I think, wrote a $7 or $8 billion check. So it was at that point that my partner and I said, okay, we're being offered to go get equity or all the publicly traded kind of good stuff. And we were totally uninterested, right? We were like, we're meant to run our own companies. So thank you for everything. We decided to kind of retire. My wife was homeschooling my girls at the time, and my kids. And so I was like ski dad, farm dad. And we were living on this kind of 100-acre farm in Alpine where it was actually, I'm working with Martine and his crew to pick stuff. And so I had a wonderful little 18-month break. And then it was in 2018, then we started EVO. So Tim Wall, who was our old boss at Protection One, called us as now the CEO of ADT. And it's like, come on, you guys, like, you got all these dudes who knock doors, like, at least come and open a dealership and I'll help you do that. And so he gave us a little bit of money to kind of help us do that. And so we just got a couple of our guys and said, okay, we're going to go do real estate and maybe source some deals, but this would be a great portfolio mix to have our guys out selling. And that way our people have jobs and they're excited about their future. Those guys went in the first year, they became a top 5 ADT dealer. So they invited us down to an ADT conference down in Vegas, and we got introduced to SafeStreets. All these guys that we knew back in the early 2000s when we were an ADT dealer had all joined forces and created one company. And the reason Jared and I, Chappell, who is my business partner and at the time, we didn't see security as a real viable like next step, because that national network took us so long to build, and it's so painful and so expensive. So in our mind, it was like, why would we take that risk? Well, now we're sitting in front of these guys and they're long in the tooth. They're like getting old, and they're like, hey, would you guys be interested in potentially coming and buying some of the company and helping us run it? And we kicked the tires on that for 8, 9, 10 months. And then we pulled the trigger and bought half of the company initially. And then over the last 5 years, have bought all the other partners out to where it's just Jared and I and our CFO. And so, so that whole thing was a wild roller coaster for me. But I mean, I'm still in the game. I'm a one trick pony. I just keep selling security.
I mean, yeah, wow. I mean, so much to unpack there. I feel like that is quite the ride.
It was a ride
that you went on.
Yeah, it was a ride.
That's insane. So going back to Pinnacle so Golden Gate, was that the name of the private equity firm?
Yeah, okay. They were just out of San Fran, obviously.
What was your guys' like revenue at the time that they were interested in coming in and acquiring or doing that deal with you guys?
Yeah, I think it was around $300 million, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that deal, was it a debt deal? Well, you mentioned the line of credit, but was it like, hey, we'll take 70% as debt? Or was it equity? They just wrote a check?
Yeah, all of that smart guy stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, there were levels and mezzanines, and yeah, there was notes that we had to hold. And yeah, so it was literally, I'm a door-to-door guy that's now sitting in a world where I'm like, are these guys even speaking English?
Yeah.
Right? So as we looked at their main source was like, hey, we can leverage an account based on its just natural value. We'll do it at half of its value, and then there's a lot of upside for us all. So basically what they were doing is every time we produced an account, they would say, okay, how much did it cost us to create that? There's your money.
Yeah.
And so we made our access to their cash was contingent on our ability to produce. And then we had earnouts, and we had money that was put to the side based on some performance. But we knocked all those covers off the ball because for once we just worked on sales ops and sales and training and all those things.
Got it. Yeah. And you mentioned you at one point, sounds like prior to the deal with Protection One, that you'd sold off a lot of the accounts. Was that just like, because you hear about pest companies that will build up accounts and then just go sell like the accounts or the revenue stream. Is that what you guys had done at that point?
Yeah, I mean, we sold the majority of those accounts to probably ADT. ADT, any of the big players. Yeah, we just basically said, here's our account book, here's all our historical pay data, and they would say, we'll take all of Greater Chicago, we'll take these states, and so there was a year there where Golden Gate, basically it was their asset that they're now cashing out.
Okay.
Yeah, so it was more for them. And I guess, I know now that a lot of these private equity guys like to get in and out of deals in 3 to 5 years. Mm-hmm. And we kind of hit the deal fatigue where they're like, okay, we're ready. And we got the contracts to do it. The market, we can get a decent clip on these. And so that's what kind of shut the door on that deal is time to cash out.
And I mean, when you guys did the deal with Protection One, they wanted you to do 80,000 accounts.
Yeah.
Was it 80,000?
Yeah.
Were you kind of starting from scratch at that point, or did you have a bunch of? I mean, you had some of your team left, but did it feel like you were rebuilding at that point?
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, it's like tail between your legs, like but with some drive of knowing what we were capable of.
Right.
So I don't think we ever doubted that we were. I never felt like I'll never be or. Like, it wasn't like complete dejection. I mean, I got to thank Vivint for being around, because it was like the pucker factor of being good was next level. Like, to compete with those guys was really tough, and all it did was create a ton more value for me. So I'm in no way mad about it, right? I mean, I'm like, I got deep respect for all those guys over there, both the ones that started it and those guys that were kind of at the regional level that ran it. And some of those guys worked for me in the early Pinnacle days and became kingpins over at Vivint. So, you kind of feel like you had something to do, even though maybe you didn't.
Yeah.
Like, I trained him when he was young, and now he's killing it over at Vivint. So, but it was a complete rebuild. I mean, we went down to probably a third of what we had prior to the exodus of a bunch of our sales team.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah. And I mean, you mentioned Vivint. So what is the difference? I mean, I way back in the day, I did customer care for Vivint.
Did you?
Like, that was
cool.
my first job after my mission for whatever I did. But what's the difference between like a SafeStreets and a Vivint? I know Vivint has their own. I mean, from what I understand, they manufacture their own, tablet in the house, and they've got all their own equipment. So I don't think they're partnered with like an ADT or something like that.
Yeah, they're independent. They're a bigger version of what we were when we were with Golden Gate.
Okay.
The one thing they did that we never stepped into was the equipment. That one just felt too dicey, and I don't know whether they are glad they did it or not. But yeah, they've got their own kind of branded. I'm sure it's all getting made at probably the same factory, but yeah, they were innovative on some of their equipment years ago. I don't know. We don't run into them like we used to. Back half of my business is through partners and call centers. So, and then a fourth of my business is with independent dealers that have nothing to do with Utah. And then we have maybe a 20 to 25,000 account summer team that sometimes run into Vivint, but it's not the good old wild, wild west like it used to be. But yeah, Vivint they are their own brand, right? We, other than our Pinnacle run with Golden Gate, we're repping another brand. Yeah. So we're kind of we would probably be viewed as a little less sophisticated because we're not having to year-round service. Like right now, I have to service my customers for 90 days and I have to guarantee the contract for 13 months. Vivint, they have to be there for all their service calls forever. I hand my stuff over to ADT.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a catch-22 to say, okay, well, which one's better? One of them is a little less headache, and that's called letting ADT deal with some of the post stuff.
Yep.
And we've been there on both. There's a bit of a attrition treadmill that you get on once you get to kind of hundreds of thousands of customers, where it's like, if we have a 10% attrition, that means for every 100,000, I got 10,000 customers that I need to replace every year to just stay at zero. So there is a tail on the other side of having all your customers answer to you that takes some additional work. But Vivint's done a great job.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, Steve. And so SafeStreets sounds like you initially acquired a piece of it. You've now kind of bought everyone out.
Yeah.
Yeah, where do you guys stand right now? I mean, it sounds like 2018 was kind of the inception of SafeStreets. Where are you at now? Kind of what's your market share? Where are you on revenue? What's the goal for SafeStreets?
Yeah, well, our goal is to continue. I mean, now I think since we've kind of sold some companies, there's a part of you that kind of longs to have something that you keep. And, now that my oldest just got home from a mission, my second's on a mission, my third is a senior, and it's like they now are asking questions about like, oh, could I maybe come in and work? And so so I want my kids to kind of be around some of the people that I've been around for the last 20 years. Some of them have been with me almost the entire time. And so I feel like SafeStreets for us is a legacy play and has more to do with kind of feeding our philanthropic efforts and also our desire to create an environment where people can excel. So we SafeStreets, I mean, we'll do maybe 350 in revenue, and 100,000 customers, and we own a piece of a solar company, and we also dabble into commercial where we're doing, we have a national Wendy's contract, and we're working on some other big ones like CarMax and Adidas, and so we have some other segments of the business that we feel are a good complement to kind of our skill set. But for us, it's like to really make a good human impact, you got to kind of control it from the top.
Yeah.
And so we feel like this is our opportunity to let our kids, as they launch into their lives, I don't necessarily think this is something where we'll hand the keys over, but let this be a place where you can be mentored, you can meet people, and you can kind of find things that you like, and then go, our kids are going to go do their own thing. I have 6 kids. My partner has 8.
Yeah.
So a lot of little humans that we hope to run through, the company.
Yeah. That's such a benefit to, being a business owner. You can help your kids learn. You put them you slot them in where it makes sense. So you mentioned the 120 acres. It was 120 in Alpine?
Yeah.
And I saw, I don't know where it was. It looked like maybe a little bit of an older website, but there was this development, the Ridge at Alpine.
Yeah.
What's that about?
Yeah. So after the Golden Gate transaction, my buddy Jared owned 120 acres up there. And he was like, hey, I'm going back. We're done. Like, I'm going back to Idaho. And I'm like, well, don't sell that, because it's just it was a Utah county, so it wasn't even in the city, so you could shoot guns and have horses and pigs and whatever. So I bought it from my buddy Jared, and then I acquired some little pieces around me. So my neighbor sold, and there was another 60, and so I got it to just over 200.
Wow.
And then I started looking into entitlement. Like, I'm like, maybe we should develop half of this and can help fund our little farm or whatever. So we started down the entitlement, and we actually got it annexed into the city. And then I got approved for 72 lots, and the city kind of changed something. I thought I was going to keep like 40 acres so I could, my kids liked riding horses, and, you know, we had goats or whatever. We had like this little hobby farm, but the city came back and said, we're going to have to put this road through, and it like intersected right where I wanted to keep land. And also, as like an idiot, you know, why would you ever develop in your neighborhood? And so I unfortunately irritated people who were like, hey, when I bought this house, they said this would never be developed. I'm like, well, I didn't sell you that house. I bought it, and now I'm going to develop it. And so I irritated some people in the neighborhood, which, you know, I get it. We're changing scenery, and people had been there a decade. So we decided to just move off the farm. We tore down the house. We did 72 lots. And, you know, going into COVID, we thought, oh man, we're going to have to hold this thing forever. We had no idea that everyone from California was about to want to buy a lot in Alpine. Yeah. And so what we initially started our pricing out at, it doubled and then tripled pretty quickly. So we kind of burned through those 72 lots really quick. And Symphony Homes came in and bought like 20 lots, and I just exchanged it. My neighbor had maybe 70 or 75 acres. And so we just kind of exchanged it, and we put all our farm stuff up there and kept the horses. And then we just bought a house down the street in a different neighborhood, but very close, within a mile of the old farm.
That's crazy. Yeah. I mean, like just a little 120 acre real estate deal on the side there. I mean, developer, security.
I had no idea what I was getting into.
You're doing everything. That's amazing.
Yeah, it was a good lesson. We learned a lot. And a funny note is, you know, when do you ever get to name streets? Like, that was just never something I ever even thought of. Yeah. And so there were, there were 7 streets that needed to be named, and I have 6 kids and a wife. So every street is named after one of my, so there's like Eliza Court, Savannah Circle, Dean Court, Zachary Way, Catherine Way. That. Yeah, Adam Circle and Annie. So everyone got a name but me.
And those lots, and those lots, they're all sold?
I mean, yep, they're all sold. I just sold my last one.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. Well, I'll have to find out where that is. Super interesting, because my goal is always to tell my wife, I'm like, we need to end up in Alpine. Like, that's our dream.
Oh, come on. So, yeah, we'd love you up
there. That's awesome. Well, I wanted to wrap up here, Steve. Prior to recording, you'd sent me over a link to Tiny Hero.
Yeah.
I would love to hear, a little bit more about that, what that means to you.
Yeah. So it was at our 20-week ultrasound for my last child. So Adam, it was during our Protection 1 days. We just went to the ultrasound, and it was like, we got problems. It was very, very quick that we realized this wasn't like the other 5. So they had a doctor come in and say, you got to go see a specialist, but it looks like your son's, all of his intestines and liver and stuff are in his chest. So you've got yourself a pretty serious thing. And they named it, they just said, don't Google it. And it was congenital diaphragmatic hernia, which is basically a hole in the diaphragm. And then the abdominal contents go into the chest, and the lungs don't form properly. And the babies typically die fairly quickly after birth. So I mean, and my wife's a nurse, right? So she knew very quickly how bad it was, and I couldn't wait. I Googled it that night, and it was pretty horrifying, where, we weren't 1 or 2 visits in after getting a fetal scan. They were like, you should just abort this and call it good. Like, he's not going to survive. I mean, I think, I'm glad we've been able to help families who it's their first child. I'm glad it was our 6th. Like, we had some bucks in the account. We were self-actualized. We had kids who were, blissfully unaware, but faithful. And so my wife and I just am like, okay, what we're trying to avoid is any regret. So in a time like this, when you're being told multiple times, just end the pregnancy, and we're like, well, mama's health is not at risk. Let's let our son decide how he wants this to go. And so we're going to take this full term, and we're going to do everything to align with somebody who can help us. So we kind of scoured, we were willing to go anywhere. So we just reached out kind of the top 10, UCSF had a experimental surgery. So we talked to them in San Francisco. Then we talked to Texas Children's, which is a big, well-known children's hospital. And then there's CHOP, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, which is kind of the gold standard. And all of them kind of said the same thing, which is, highly unlikely for survival. My wife ran into a parent-run website called Real Hope for CDH. None of the phone numbers worked. It had clearly been taken over by a bot or, an out of country. And so none of the switch numbers were working, but it said that there was a doctor in Florida who specifically focused on this very condition. And the only way to deal with it is through treatment. And that was it. So my wife just called. He was at UF. So he's in Florida in Gainesville. And so she just called the switchboard and said, hey, I'm looking for David Kays. And they buzzed her right over to his assistant, and we made a phone call appointment. And here we have a pediatric surgeon that like for an hour and a half took all our questions, like after hours. And he's like, well, why don't you guys just come out and you can meet some families who we've treated and are leaving and meet our team. And so we went out there, and it was immediately like, we found the Michael Jordan of diaphragmatic hernia. Like this will be our best chance. So we took all of our kids, my mother-in-law, and we moved out to Gainesville before my son was born. And then we spent 3 months. I mean, he came out as advertised, the sickest kid in the hospital. I mean, the surgeon was the guy who oversaw this, was like, your son is the sickest person in this hospital. He was on complete life support. He had that lung, instead of being the size of a softball, was the size of a bean. So what happens when you cut the umbilical cord, that blood rushes to the lungs, and it's like a fire hose. It's like a fire hydrant connecting to a garden hose. The vessels are too small. And so that's usually when those babies die. Well, they immediately, within 72 hours, put him on a full heart-lung bypass. So you have this massive machine that is basically pumping his blood, oxygenating it, taking out the carbon dioxide. So it was like he's truly on life support. But like the little warrior he is, my little guy just persevered, and we had such an engaging, like, watching other families dealing with this, and our experience was so different because I wasn't stressed, wasn't worried about the bills. I could just be completely there for my kids as well as my wife. And we would just run shifts, and we just spent a ton of time next to Adam's bed kind of cheering him on. And, it wasn't we never got told, hey, he's going to survive, until the doctor was sure. So there were weeks there where it was like minute by minute. He's like, you need to be here as much as possible. And so in that very raw state, you really start thinking about what's important. And you also start thinking about your entire life. Like, okay, what have I done with my life? And when you got a kid that's on life support, and you're like, I don't even know if he's coming. Should we even take a car seat to Florida? Like, are we, and you have this gentleman who's like, Adam's going to make it. And, and I remember sitting next to Adam's bed and being like, that's the one problem with Tiny Hero. It gets me. I'm like, what can I do for a guy who, like, saved my kid? Like, you buy him a Range Rover. Like, so I'm talking to David, and I'm like, David, thank you, right? Like, how do I repay you? And he's like, well, Steve, I'm a surgeon. I'm not a marketer, but there are babies all over this country that are dying because they're not getting my kind of care. I mean, your son was extreme on the spectrum, and any other facility, he lives for 2 hours. And I need you to go tell this story and help me save more babies, because this is why I'm here on earth. And so I went back to Adam's bed, and literally I hear a voice that says, this is why you've been blessed. And I'm like, oh, it makes total sense. Why did this idiot from Taylorsville, I mean, I'm a nice enough guy, but like, I also know people that are way smarter, that work as hard or harder, that have all the ingenuity in the world. Why am I here in this position, I have to pinch myself sometimes and go, man, why this? And I think it, hindsight now being 2020, it's like the heavens knew what was coming, and they also knew that there wasn't anything more important to me than my family. And if we could help any of these families avoid a casket and instead have a normal life, then we could do something for someone that would be fundamentally changing. And so that's when we started Tiny Hero. And I can't tell you that there has been anything that I've done that's been more rewarding. There is not a check size. There is no cool thing that you could buy or stay in or see that is as cool as getting a text from a parent that says, Lila just had her 4th birthday and we have you guys to thank. And, our immediate response is like, don't thank us, thank God. This is a club you don't want to be a part of, but when you do, we have this support mechanism. My wife was brilliant. My wife's been running this thing almost the whole time. I've been the resource. She's been the brain. And we've been able to help a lot of families, and it's also changed the way that we do business from the standpoint of like, my inner team knows like the reason I am here today and the reason I'm working like I'm working is because on the other side of this, there's a family that's having to make a life and death situation and a decision. And whatever problem you bring to me, just so you know, I'm trying to solve that problem, and this problem we can solve. And so there is no problem we can't get out of, because on the other side of this, I need this place to help me save these babies. And so it's been so rewarding for us to get to know these people. We do fun runs. We do, we have people who support us. We get random things all the time. But the goodness of humanity is so in effect when it comes to people in need. And all the business stuff has been just an amazing roller coaster. I've learned so much, but I'm thankful that I was guided the way I was, because I look back now and I'm like, I needed that experience, like dealing with the stress of starting a company and dealing with the stress of a child on life support. Had I not that break your back kind of stress initially, I don't think I could have dealt with, watching my wife and my kids go, oh my gosh, like, is he going to make it? So I really am thankful that I was given an opportunity to realize that these, what most would say lucky, in the end were just all divine touch. And that it's a bigger purpose. And so Tiny Hero is my heart and soul. SafeStreets is my vehicle to make sure that I never can say no to a family that calls. And I feel like SafeStreets is blessed because of that. Because I've surrounded myself with some amazing people that'd be far more interesting to talk to than me. And so I really feel the gravity of my inadequacy, and to be sitting in this position to where I could maybe inspire somebody else to think outside of the box. It's typically because there's something bigger coming that will create a sense of value that you could never get with worldly success. It's going to be the divine, it's going to be the family, it's going to be the holy cause where you can do something for someone that they cannot do for themselves. And when you find yourself in that environment, you don't ever want to be out of it.
Yeah, that's, amazing, Steve. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I love how you are able to have that perspective of tying in, the purpose of your success is to give back, and layering that in with SafeStreets and your success there. It's so cool. Can people get involved? Is there a way that they can help out, whether through donations or other ways with it, or are you kind of just self-funding and it's all just...
Well, the IRS has this little thing called "There's only so much you can do," so I'm not too proud to beg. Sure. And all my friends know this, so I've got a great group of friends. But yeah, you go to tinyhero.org and you can see our story. But more than anything, it's the hundreds of stories that it's a platform for families. This is not a charity about us or about our son. It was where it started. This is a platform for an entire community, and it's now an international community, and we need the money. Because there are families that are in dire straits, and it is very fun. But anyone who has any inkling to need a philanthropic cause, go to tinyhero.org. We have a donate now page. We also update our events that are throughout the country. We have an entire team that just does fun runs throughout the country. I try to not bug my friends too often. Those guys initially, I mean, I went to the well so many times that there are times where I'm like, I'm sorry, guys. But I have so many generous friends that, I mean, even some of the guys that you mentioned have been big supporters of me and our charity. So, definitely, if any, and if there are other charities that, I mean, if somebody wanted to get started, like if I've had a lot of people just reach out to me and go, okay, like, what was your premise? And then how did you get started? Like there's not enough charities with good intent out there. So if anyone ever needed a little bit of advice, because we did it right, but there are only a few steps that you need to take to get something going. And I think more people need to have that holy cause, because I'm like, so much of my upside in life has come through that anywhere I can to get people involved, I do.
Yeah. Well, you're amazing. That's amazing. Thanks for sharing that, Steve. And I don't think there's really a better way to end. So thank you so much for being here, Steve, and sharing your story.
Enjoyed it. Thank you for having me, Chase. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.